Good morning, friends. It is Monday, May 22nd. This channel has a pretty tight set of topics that we do stray outside of some. I use it to update kind of a network while I'm still active, and then it's going to be an archive of, what was I up to? Presuming it survives, presuming a lot about infrastructure and so on. I kind of have a library science attitude in that I am always aware of, or I try to be aware of who can see what's a public archive, what's a private archive. So sometimes I'll be sharing the content of TrimTab Book Club, for example. But this particular archive, unless you're a subscriber, you won't be able to come into it right now. Whereas free lists, where I'm talking to Andreas and the group that he's bringing together based in Lithuania in his case. That free list is Open Archive. Sometimes I'll cut and paste from any of these archives to a place called Synergio, which is also open. And I do these cross postings partly because, like, if I do some piece of writing that I think is useful in TrimTab, for example, but I want to share it with more people, then I will take my own work and cut and paste it to somewhere else sometimes, and vice versa. So that gives you kind of a picture of how I operate, just in terms of trying to keep my little microcosm accessible, searchable, and so on. Because I think what goes on here is useful. I'm going to start with this blog post called Evolving Mythology, May 18th, 2023. It's in controlroom.blogspot.com. This just, you could call it an icon or diagram of STEAM crossing path. That's from STEM, which was science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This reminds me a lot of a Western technique, or we can call it Western, a European convention of having the trivium and the quadrivium and dividing up into seven. This ends up being seven disciplines. 1, 2, 3, 4. They share anthropology. The A for me is anthropology, which includes art. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so there's 8. 8 instead of trivium, quadrivium. P is philosophy. And this little corner up here of, we call it PAM or MAP, where we've got anthropology, mathematics, and philosophy kind of in a tight little corner. This is where I am on Math for Wisdom, chatting with a fairly math literate group. Once you average in Andreas, who's highly math limited, highly math literate, we're all limited, highly math literate and highly math limited, as are we all. That's not a criticism. Freedom and limits, right? We can't be all things to all people. We can't be other than people or personalities. We are, each one of us, a finite mortal individual. And that's a cool thing. That's a good thing. So I am referring to Walt Disney and my inspirations in the 80s, how I was feeling positive about the future, if at all, which, let's say, I was kind of mixed mind about where I thought the world was going. I always kind of have been, and that's kind of how it feels to be on planet Earth, right? We don't have that sense of security, mainly because, the General Assembly has criminalized nuclear weapons. I'm talking about the United Nations. But nobody really knows that or talks about that or can even believe it's true. They don't see nuclear weapons as criminal, and the whole world criminal doesn't really mean much, because at the top level, at least in my model, you could say organized crime / organized religion is what's running the show. So in terms of, like, what's legal, those are little pockets, like pocket protectors, little legal pockets where things are done according to strict ethics. But, that's not the global, that's the local. many localities, and they don't all share the same rules, obviously. So these little rule-based communities, they can be very tight, very well run. But overall, I don't think it makes sense to talk about the rule of law at the global level, especially when we're in the middle of hot wars in Europe. It's not possible to talk about the rule of law when the world is at war like this. So, of course, I take with a grain of salt this idea um, that there's a legal framework in which we have to operate when it comes to global development. If we're going to the next level, we all have to take matters into our own hands. I don't mean break the law so much as there just aren't any rules at some level that you got to make it up as you go along. And in my case, I feel my job's easier than, say, Bucky Fuller here in his job because he was kind of starting more from scratch. He was surfing on the technological revolution of his day. The invention of radio, the mastery of electromagnetic spectrum, um, hydropower, and just power in general was really coming into its own. Tesla, AC, DC, Edison. He lived through all of that, right? Going to the moon eventually. So people were amazed and optimistic and were willing to listen to his sort of positive futurism. And they were willing to be bemused by his mathematics, which is what I'm going to say is where I'm saying we're in kind of a corner here. The P for philosophy, that's where I've planted these little philosophical investigations that get down to the real grammar of the namespace that we're in. Like, can we call the caltrops, caltrop vectors, the four vectors from the center of a tetrahedron to its four corners, and doing linear combinations to get to all points? Can we call those all basis vectors? And the argument against it is like, no, you can make the fourth caltrop vector from the other three. And what I argue in this Math for Wisdom thing list is actually no, it's not that simple because you're allowing negation. You've got all this like semantics we could go into. I'm not going to, in this video, get into my argument in too much depth. Actually, there's not much to say. It's just I can use the word basis vectors for those four home base vectors if I want to. Nor do they have to be unit length. And then I give my justifications in terms of I don't need to reverse the direction. I don't need the operation of negation to reach all points in space using quadrats. And this is very esoteric, but it's a way of communicating with the professional mathematician subcultures under M through anthropology, where at P we're talking about American literature, we're talking about Hugh Kenner, the Pound era. This is where my channel links synergetics into the humanities, right? And then we're using Fuller's own biography to link up with all kinds of intellectuals and interesting currents of thought throughout the 1900s. So in unlocking the 1900s literary world, right, the world of James Joyce, not that he was American, but just literary world, like I'm saying, the world of poetics, the world of intellectual history, right? To unlock that through Fuller requires unlocking what he talked about mathematically, and that's happening in the P domain, which you could call psychology. I call it philosophy for the most part. But where P links, philosophy and psychology link, there you have Fuller. This is how I'll conclude for today. There is where you have Fuller talking about Freud. And this has been a big conversation lately on the Trim Tab Book Club. What was Fuller's attitude towards Freud? And what we're finding is, he doesn't write about Freud all over the place. It's not something he doesn't want synergetics to like become a vehicle for a lot of other voices. Fuller is very singular in his voice. He does link to a small cast of characters. Willard Gibbs, Leonhard Euler, Boltzmann. These are people he likes to talk about a lot. Einstein, in terms of STEM people, right? He also talks about a lot of path people, but not a lot. Like he spends a lot of time with them as contemporaries. He's hanging out with Toynbee. He's hanging out with Marshall McLuhan. He's collaborating, right? Werner Erhard, all these people. He's collaborating, but he's not writing voluminously about his contemporaries that much. He's going to leave that to the next generations to wire it up, which is what I've been doing. But he is willing to connect to Freud and say how important Freud is in just opening our minds to the fact of how much is outside our conscious awareness and yet is so critical to what goes on. Fuller is one of those who he wants us to cultivate our consciousness, our awareness. He's all about, being awake, you could say, in the enlightened sense. Not really sure if we need a definition at this point. But he's highly, highly respectful of what we'll call the invisible, which you could also call the extrasensory, and just it's not anti-scientific to talk about that, although he admits, you start talking about telepathy, you're outside of established science and stuff, but that doesn't mean there isn't extrasensory stuff going on. We don't think in terms of how it feels to digest our food exactly. I mean, a lot of our internal organs, we're aware of them occasionally, but it's not like we spend a lot of time focusing on growing hair, growing our fingernails. Breathing we can kind of take control of, but a lot of times we're not. And so there's this epiphenomenalism in Fuller's writing, where he's very keen to acknowledge the 99%, you could say, unconsciousness of it all. It's a big part of his worldview. And he's kind of towards Freud in that. He's nodding towards Freud when it comes to, you could say, the between the lines. You've got the literal in your face conscious meaning of something, and then like in Norman O'Brown's Love's Body, you've got the unconscious, which kind of seeps through the lines. And synergetics is sensitive to that. It like sets up a resonant namespace where you can tune in, kind of like a radio. A lot of those, I'd call them unconscious frequencies, meaning you can listen with comprehension to a lot of different people because they're unconscious of each other, maybe, or they can't understand each other. But if you're a really good thinker, partly what you get from that is you at least find other people comprehensible. I'm not saying you agree or whatever, that's maybe not even important. You're just good at tuning in, able to get the info and stuff. And Fuller was like that. He was very good at tuning stuff in and then being able to interpret people to each other. He played a very interesting role politically. And that's what I'm saying. We can't really understand the 1900s without him. So that may not sound intuitive to you, and it may not sound like any curriculum you're familiar with. All of this may seem somewhat alien, and I recognize that. That's partly why I cultivate this YouTube channel, to make sure that what the little bit that is out there doesn't just flicker out. But there is a good community here, so feel free to join us. Talk to you later.